If the government of India buys a particular product, then foreign companies start looking at that. India, in the teeth of those sanctions, developed its own ballistic missile capabilities, and now every single missile and every single Indian nuclear warhead is mounted on domestic capability. So this was a bunch of scientists in South India and the area around Hyderabad who have developed India's missile capabilities into a world-class ballistic missile defense. Electronic warfare systems, where India has brilliant capabilities, where we will be able to generate a market outside given the right policies. The representatives of these big Western companies feel more comfortable working in India.
Hello and welcome to Money Connect, a special series by Mint and Edelweiss Mutual Fund. Today we'll be talking about leveraging defense technology, the role of startups and the private sector. India is no longer just a major importer of defense equipment. It is fast emerging as a global defense manufacturing hub, with 21,000 crores in defense exports in FY24, marking a 20 times growth over the past decade. The country is redefining its role in the global defense economy. The government has set an ambitious target of 50,000 crores in defense exports by 2029, signaling a new growth phase. This transformation is being driven by a strategic push for self-reliance, leading to 75% of the modernization budget being earmarked for procurement through domestic sources, accelerating private sector participation. A strong emphasis on indigenous manufacturing of fighter jets, missiles, naval ships and UAVs, and the rise of private players and defense tech startups, spearheading innovation in AI, drones and cyber warfare technologies. But what does this mean for India's economy, global positioning and investment landscape? Can Indian defense firms compete on the global stage? And most importantly, where do the best opportunities lie for investors? To break this down, we are now joined by Colonel Ajai Shukla, retired, one of India's most respected defense analysts. Colonel Shukla, thank you so much for joining us. He has served for over 2 decades in the Indian Army in critical postings like Nagaland, Jammu and Kashmir and Africa for 2 decades. Since retiring, he has spent another 2 decades as a journalist, war correspondent and commentator on South Asia's defense and security landscape. His expertise spans everything from military technology to defense economics. So let's dive deep into this intersection of defense, technology and market potential. Once again, Colonel Shukla, thank you so much for joining us on the show. Now, India's defense exports have grown about 20 times to about 21,000 crore rupees in FY24. What do you think are the key factors that have driven this change in the defense sector?
Well, there are 2 or 3 key factors. The first is the orientation, the strategic orientation of the West is shifted from not just building up China as one of those big recipients of orders from the West and one of the big manufacturers of systems and subsystems that go into larger integrated systems like Boeing in Seattle and so on. So the realization has crept into the West that they have been responsible for building up China as the 900-pound gorilla that it is. And therefore, they now need to recalibrate
and de-risk.
Risk and de-risk by shifting manufacturing technology and actual manufacture from China to India.
But why India? Because they could go anywhere. How does...
Because India is strategically aligned with the West. It has partnerships with, manufacturing partnerships with companies like Boeing and Airbus and Lockheed Martin, which are already there on the ground and which they just need to give a certain boost and fillip to. So it's easier to work with India than with China. There's the language sort of problem that they face in China. And people generally, these representatives of these big Western companies feel more comfortable working in India.
Yeah, but all this has happened only over the last 10 years. What changed? Has the ecosystem also changed? It's one thing to have a private partnership between an American manufacturer and an Indian manufacturer that has been in the game for, say, 50 years. What changed in those 10 years that, suddenly exports have jumped 20x?
Well, I still remember the day in the FICCI headquarters when George Fernandez announced that the private sector will be allowed into defense. So it was only as recently as 2001 that the private sector was even recognized as a defense player or a potential defense partner. But from then till the end of the UPA regime, there was not so much movement in the manufacturing and sort of the infrastructure of manufacture as happened after the BJP came to power. And a lot of these companies, by coming into the field of aerospace and defense, are generating a lot more employment. So there are all these things that are snowballing into this massive snowball and sort of carrying the defense manufacturer along.
Was there any turning point that you think happened? Because, you mentioned George Fernandez. He had gone to Ladakh and then he said, our soldiers don't have night vision goggles. Our police people go into the field without proper bulletproof jackets. So was there a turning point where the government felt, we really need to step up the game and let's do it efficiently without the corruption issues and let's do it domestically?
Well, that's a good question, and I would say that if one had to identify a turning point, it would be the Indo-US Defense Framework Agreement of 2005, which was then renewed in 1995, renewed to 2005, renewed to 2015, and now currently they're discussing renewing it to 2025. That recognized India as a key US partner, a country that had a certain stature, a certain size, a certain ability to be the regional peacekeeper, and that meant shifting a lot of their manufacture from China to India. So there would be other key turning points as well. For example, the Defense Procurement Procedure, DPP 2012. That was a major change and that galvanized the sector. But if I was to also add one more change to the two that I've already outlined, it would be the sort of the US industry partnerships with the Indian industry, which was not there earlier. The US industry would not sort of think of outsourcing their sort of subsystems.
Why? Was there an issue of trust, of capability? Why? What changed for them? They were like, oh, now we trust our Indian partners.
It was the rise of China, we've already talked about. The understanding that India had to be built up as a regional partner to China. But this made many Indian industries, first the defense public sector undertaking, and then gradually the private sector enter the field and sort of find it very difficult in the beginning. But the government, I have to say, played along. It put the sort of institutional framework into place, and now you have these companies that are just churning out the stuff.
So let's talk about this procurement policy. What had changed? Because now what we understand is that 75% of defense procurement now has to be done through Indian companies, and there's a specific earmarked amount for private sector companies as well. How has this impacted the industry landscape?
Well, if one has to look at one single trend that has changed the landscape, it is the recognition by successive governments, first the UPA government and now 3 NDA governments in a row, that India is a country where you cannot just leave everything to the public sector. The private sector has its own efficiencies, its own abilities, its technological prowess. In the latest budget, you have seen incentives being given to the private sector for manufacture. And that is what has sort of galvanized the defense production in private sector. One other point I have to make is that it is not just the public sector or the private sector. They are both working in tandem. The private sector earlier was just a feeder that used to get the overflow from the public sector. But now it's not just defense manufacture. This is an important point to note. It's aerospace and defense. A lot of the aerospace manufacture is actually meant not for military transports and military aircraft. It's meant for the private industry, Boeing, Airbus, Embraer. These are the companies that have started sourcing from India.
Over the years, even warfare has changed, right? So if our companies are exporting to the world with the changed scenario of warfare, what is being demanded globally? You know, what are the subsectors to watch out for? Missiles, UAV, naval defense. You know, what is being demanded globally? Where do we see that export potential, and are there Indian companies that can capitalize on it?
There are certain fields in which we've done very well, in which we are emerging as a sort of global level player, and certain fields which we have not done so well, for the simple reason that we missed out on the industrial revolution, and since then have fallen further and further behind in the manufacture of sophisticated aerospace and defense things. But we have to mention, first of all, India's abilities, developed abilities in the nuclear field, starting from the Shakti blasts of 1974 to the 1998 nuclear tests. So India then, after having done its nuclear tests, was then able to
develop ballistic missiles.
Develop the ballistic missile technologies in the face of the tightest international sanctions. So this was a bunch of scientists in South India and the area around Hyderabad who have developed India's missile capabilities into a world-class ballistic missile defense. After the 1998 nuclear tests, there were sanctions on numerous different types of technology, some of them completely unjustifiable. But then eventually from the 2004 tsunami onwards, the West has realized that India is a real gatekeeper in this Indian Ocean region, and it's been an uphill story, a positive story since then.
Yeah, but what are the subsectors from now on in future warfare will be required by companies around the world, and they look at India to be able to supply, be it because we are indigenously manufacturing or innovating on these new technologies, or we're partnering with technologically forward companies in the West. What are the areas where you see good growth in the export side?
The Atmanirbhar Bharat or Make in India story actually began in the early 1960s. When the Indian Navy decided that it had to be a builder's navy, not a buyer's navy. We just could not afford the Western warships at the prices in which they were being sold. So we started building our own
carriers.
And starting from the Leander class frigates at the end of the 1960s, it's been a story of added capabilities gradually, and the development of one's own warship capabilities. So that warship story is an overwhelmingly positive story, and it's something the Indian Navy deserves a lot of credit for. Then came the nuclear blasts and the sanctions on missile technology. India, in the teeth of those sanctions, developed its own ballistic missile capabilities. And now every single missile and every single Indian nuclear warhead is mounted on domestic capability.
Okay.
Then there is the rise of India's IT profession, and at the same time the digitization of weaponry, which meant that if you had a good IT capabilities, your weaponry would be that much more advanced, and that too through domestic means. And now we have the next revolution in defense manufacturing, which are drones and airborne autonomous vehicles. And India is at the forefront of that as well.
What about defense simulations? Because I think
defense simulations I include in that digital capability. We are able to completely simulate a sort of missile even before building the first rivet for that missile. So you have that missile in in digital form shown to the viewers. The viewers are satisfied with the missile, and only then does the actual production begin.
All right. How has the entry of private sector energize India's defense sector? Because historically, defense was closed door, PSU, because of whatever technology transfer or development which was done by government's defense scientists. How has the entry of private sector changed the defense sector in India?
Well, the private sector has a completely different business ethos from the public sector. The public sector was more like a sarkari department. They would produce the goods, but there would be time overruns, cost overruns, and a general air of, let's do this at our pace.
There was no competition, basically.
There was not only no competition, but there was no incentive for sort of better work and faster work.
Okay.
All that changed when the competition emerged, which was again 2001, George Fernandez's press note number 2. And that sort of got the public sector onto a more galvanized mode. So right now there are some public sector undertakings that are in such a position of advantage that it will take a long time for the private sector to reach them.
And why is that advantage? Just because they were monopolies, or do they have that technical expertise that the private sector doesn't?
They are monopolies that develop technical expertise.
Oh, okay.
Aerospace, for example, the aerospace industry, it began from very humble beginnings. There was practically nothing that they had to build upon. But then over the years, the aerospace industry has sort of worked to build its own capabilities and is today in a position where it can say we are going to build the LCA Mark II and we are going to build the advanced medium combat aircraft, and these will be world-class aircraft, and we are now in a position to, as defense planners, say yes, they have the capabilities.
Okay, so you've watched the defense sector very closely, including how the private sector has come up. For private companies in the defense sector that want to thrive, not just domestically, but also in export, would you say that it's best to develop technology themselves? Or should they be collaborating with those who innovate on technology? They may not be Indian, they may be, companies abroad. Or should they invest in their innovation and R&D themselves and work on things where they may develop something big on their own and not necessarily competing with say the PSU majors who've had years of technological advancement, taking them forward, keeping them a step ahead of the private companies?
So that's an important question. And the answer really is that you cannot develop everything yourself.
Okay.
So the first thing, for example, American aircraft, fighter aircraft, they use a British ejection seat. And that's one of the key sort of systems that actually contributes to keeping the pilot alive.
But the fuselage is made in India, right?
The fuselage is made in India, but the point I'm making is that US, with all its technological prowess, does not feel necessary to build the ejection seat itself. It says Martin Baker, which is a British company, is already building the best ejection seats in the world. Why should we duplicate its effort? We'll put our effort into another system, let's say mid-air to air refueling. And then you go there and find out that it's another British company that makes the mid-air refueling plant. So at the end of it, you have to have a very judicious understanding of what it is useful to indigenize with and what is just a duplication of effort already made somewhere. So the Indian Tejas aircraft or the AMCA have a very high indigenous component, but they by no means make
everything in India. All right. Now, there's a growing number of defense-focused IPOs and a lot of institutional investments also happening in the defense space. So, what should investors look out for in this space?
Well, investors should first look out for what the government of India is emphasizing and what it prepares to fund the making of. Because this is a field which is a field where there's just one customer.
Okay.
The government of India is the only customer. And if the government of India buys a particular product, then foreign companies start looking at that. So then you get your second layer of customers from foreign. And it is essential to have at least 2 or 3 or 4 layers because the economies of scale don't apply unless you have a large number of things. If you're making just, let's say, 15 aircraft, it's a complete waste of money to go through the whole R&D process, the whole manufacturing process, just to make 15 aircraft. It works when your own Air Force is buying it in large numbers, foreign companies are buying it in large numbers, and you're also doing things like MRO and regional hubs too. So you have to get the whole aerospace and defense ecosystem right. And only then does it make economic sense.
So for an investor, what kind of companies should they look at investing in? Because even in defense, I'm sure there are these low value add, high volume products, say munition, you need a lot of munition if you're at war or whatever, even if you're exporting, like we've seen the Ukraine-Russia war, nobody plans to be at war for 500 days. It's gone on beyond that. So you will need the munition that is going to explode. But that may be high volume, low margin, or say a spacecraft or a fighter jet. That may be more value add and lower in numbers, but high value add, high profitability. What should investors look at when they want to invest in the defense sector?
Well, I've always maintained that the first thing that one looks at is the numbers. Because unless you have a large number of that particular weapon system or defense equipment going into production, you're never going to have an economic rationale for making it or not. So you have to get the numbers right. The government of India has to be prepared to spend. While this government has done a lot of good work in Make in India, it has not raised defense spending. In fact, defense spending has been on a decline in percentage of GDP and percentage of central government expenditure. And as a consequence of which, making economic sense of the decision to build a particular aircraft or a missile is difficult to take.
It has to make more sense.
And one of the key elements that boosts the numbers is export, which is why this government, I say, has done good work because it's produced an export market. There are companies and countries that are looking at the Tejas fighter very seriously with a view to build. And once that snowballing effect starts off, then it becomes a whole lot of economic sense.
Right. So, the government of India has also done a lot to encourage this industry, be it, single vendor contracts or fast track procurement policies. It has opened the doors for private companies. Now, what is its implication for long-term investments? Because it takes a lot of capex. Okay. As investors, how do you assess the risk attached to your investment in a particular defense company or in the sector itself? Because is it as easy as, say, investing in oil and gas or drugs companies? Because you said government of India is important even if you're looking at the export market, because the proof of concept has to be validated by your government before everybody believes you.
There's a whole bunch of tests and so on.
What about things like geopolitical risk? How do people assess all of this? Does it really have an impact on the risk assessment of investing in these defense companies?
Well, the risk assessment part is a key part of any export decision, manufacturing decision, and R&D decision. It's only when you have the numbers and you have the market outside and you have the desire outside to work with India that you will get the numbers going, numbers that justify production. So in that sense, I would say that the government of India, by putting a lot of emphasis on this, has created the business environment and the business climate and the business numbers to actually justify production yourself. There are some aircraft, just to give you the latest example, the C-130J, the Hercules, which is a US aircraft. It doesn't make any sense to manufacture that aircraft in India because we are buying it in such small numbers that it will not justify setting up a production unit.
You might as well just buy it, import it.
Might as well just buy it and use that R&D money sensibly into another field, let's say electronic warfare systems, where India has brilliant capabilities, where we will be able to generate a market outside given the right policies. And when an investor is sort of making his decision, he has to be very sure that the government will support that, the military will support that, and that there is enough of a market both inside and outside the country to justify it.
All right. So usually when investors do their due diligence, they will look at companies' books, the external environment, etc. Now, when you invest in, say, the defense sector or private companies in the defense sector, would you also consider global factors, bilateral relations? Because I'm sure even if an Indian manufacturer is tying up with a US engine maker or aircraft manufacturer, the governments are involved, and until the governments are involved, it will not take off. So should you also look at bilateral agreements, geopolitical situations, all of that before making an investment decision?
There are investment decisions that actually sort of make themselves by being so obviously to a country's benefit, to our country's benefit, that it's a waste of time to start discussing it, just get on with it. Mm-hmm. Software related and IT related thing, artificial intelligence related decisions, hypersonics decisions. Now these are things in which India already has a sort of an advantage. India should just cash in on that advantage. This is where sort of good technology leadership is essential.
And that is going to, in your mind, be a winner in the defense sector at least?
That's, so far I have to say, it's still watch and wait as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
But that's maybe because for so long we've seen a sort of abdication of responsibility by governments and companies, and hopefully that is changing.
All right. Ajai Shukla, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights with us.
Talking to you and your
I'm
viewers.
sure our viewers have greatly benefited from your insights on how to invest in defense sector in our country, where we are seeing such a huge growth of exports, where defense manufacturing is really coming up in a big way to make India a global hub. Thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure. Thank you.
India's rise as a global defense exporter isn't just about strengthening its military. It's about reshaping the economy, driving technological innovation, and unlocking lucrative market opportunities. I would like to once again thank Ajai Shukla for giving us all his insights into the defense sector. And to our viewers, stay tuned for more deep dives into India's most exciting investment opportunities.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.